Let's begin with prayer. Lord Jesus, as we near the end of our discussions these past weeks, we ask that you would continue to bless our meeting together, bless our conversations, our ability to speak of the things that are on our hearts, and to see how, as we collectively come together, you have given wisdom to your people. You have given them compassion and understanding. And in this place, we are able to speak to each other, to hear one another, and to love one another. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. So again, for our online people, if you want to text in a question, the number is 262-374-5957. And before our class ends next week, I want somebody online to text in just to see if it works. So last time we spent the hour talking on suicide. And at the end of the class, there was a question, and we want to spend a little time on that today. So the question was, it was a combat situation where a soldier would throw himself on a grenade to save the lives of his fellow soldiers. And so the question was, how is that different from someone who takes his life in a different way? So any comment from the group on that? Do you see a difference in the soldier who does that compared to the situations that we talked about? Go ahead.
So from what I understand, the problem with suicide is because it's a lack of faith. And so the soldier that is saving others is not doing so because of lack of faith. He's doing so because he has faith. And he is doing it as an act of love for others.
Okay.
Well, as a person committing suicide, it could be indicative of not having faith and it's not done out of love for others.
Okay. All right, so did everybody hear that? So he was saying that in terms of the soldier, it was not a lack of faith that made him jump on that grenade, but because he had faith and because of his love for his brothers, that he was willing to sacrifice himself. So I think in our culture, we often really raise up those situations where soldiers do that. They get a hero's funeral. Sometimes they get the highest military medal that can be awarded because everyone sees that as being so heroic. So the only thing that concerns me as we make those comparisons is that then we get into the judging. And so then we say for the person who, for whatever reason, could not tolerate their life the way it was, then we place that judgment on that was a lack of faith. And one of the things we talked about last time is we really don't have that ability to judge that we know what that person's faith was at that point. So only God really knows what was going on in the mind of that person who made that decision. Sometimes I think from our standpoint, we feel that it was a lack of faith. And so in the past especially, the church would make determinations and would not do a Christian burial for that kind of situation. I think now perhaps we oftentimes just kind of leave that open. We don't have to make a judgment on that. So anything else on that that particular issue. Yes.
I think sometimes we could make a distinction between suicide and self-sacrifice. As far as the soldiers, we sometimes refer to that as self-sacrifice for the good of others.
For the good of others, right. Right. Mary?
I'm thinking of a case where someone had downed pills, many pills, and, you know, it sounded bad, like she was desperate and she wanted to kill herself. Yet she had a Christian funeral, and they read her journal entries, and they were solid Christian. Lord, help me. Her life was just crashing in on her.
Yeah.
And sometimes I wonder if people who down pills, right after they think, what have I done? And then it's too late. I mean, medically, you've done it.
Right.
So there could have been repentance at the last minute.
Right. So that, I think, is what is so important. We don't always know what was all going on. We don't have the total picture. And I think it's so interesting that they had those journal writings of that person that gave you a little bit more of a picture of who she was. And again, people were less liable to make judgments on that situation. Mm-hmm.
So, I have a question about the nature of self-sacrifice. Is that always okay? Because a soldier throwing himself on a grenade is self-sacrifice, but someone could theoretically try to sacrifice themselves for others through euthanasia to try to relieve the burden on family and friends that are taking care of them.
Mm-hmm.
And we would say that would be a sinful thing to do.
Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting one too. So he's talking about what he called self-euthanasia. So, I mean, let's say you have Lou Gehrig's disease, and it's a deteriorating, so gradually you lose function. And then you get to the point where you can't even breathe and they have to put you on a ventilator. And so then, again, there's lots of expenses medically. There's a tremendous burden on the family. And so what if that person then decides, I want to stop that? So is that, it's one of those gray areas, isn't it, where it's like, ooh, is that okay to do that? My father-in-law was on dialysis, and he also had circulatory problems in his leg. And so the doctor said to him, we have to amputate your leg because of your circulatory problems. So he said, I'm not sure if you can survive that, if your heart is strong enough that you may die on the table. Or he said, you can stop dialysis. So again, he's making a decision on what his outcome is going to be. He decided to stop dialysis. So there was some discussion among people, was he then causing his death? We as a family supported him, and we just felt that, in light of his circumstances, his quality of life, all the things that were going on there, that we felt that would maybe be the most humane way for him to let his life come to an end. So there are all of those kind of situations that arise. I think now with medical treatment being what it is, we can do all kinds of things. We can keep people alive almost forever with all of the stuff that we have. So Fredert is really kind of looking at that every day with patients that we have in our ICUs. And again, families really struggle because they feel like they're making the decision whether that person lives or dies. And that's a heavy weight. So any of you who have been in that situation, you don't want to be making those decisions. But sometimes you find yourself, you're in there, you got to do something. So that's something that affects many, many families. When we have all these medical tools, but sometimes you say, really, we're increasing the person's suffering. We're not adding to their ability to really be engaged in life, to be present with us. And so we sometimes say, let's not do that. Anything else on that? Yeah.
I think you also think about the caretaker and how much the burden is on them in that situation also.
Yeah.
The caretaker has to think about themselves, or their kids have to start to think about how they are doing.
Yeah. Yeah, the caregiver sometimes is the forgotten person because the focus is on the patient. And one other question that came up at the end of last week also was in regard to miscarriages and stillbirths. Now again, that's not a suicide situation, but I think the parallel is, again, we don't know what the state of that soul of that child was. Again, I think in the past there were judgments that were made. I had a lady in my parish that I was visiting with, had been inactive for many years, and she was telling me that she had a stillbirth. And the pastor told her that her child went to hell because it was not baptized. So, I mean, those kind of things do happen. And again, we have to look at that is God has given us baptism to, again, use that with our children and with people that are coming to faith. But if we don't have the opportunity, and there was nothing that we could do about that, well, then that is in God's hands. And we know that God loved that child. He loved that child more than we could ever love that child. So then we leave that in God's hands. And we don't make a judgment on that. So any other questions or comments on that issue? Okay, then at this point, I would like to turn over the microphone to Rachel. And Rachel wanted to speak a little bit about mental illness, and again, how that enters into the discussion that we were having last week. You give her that? Okay.
So test. Does this work? No.
So kind of bear with me. This is really hard for me to talk about. Kind of just talking about my story and everything I've been through. I was officially diagnosed with depression in May of 2013. But a lot of doctors and therapists believe that I struggled with it long before then. When I was diagnosed, my doctor instantly put me on an antidepressant, which is pretty standard throughout mental health. But 2 weeks after I was put on that antidepressant, I became catatonic and suicidal, which a lot of people don't really realize happens with a lot of antidepressants, is that they have that opposite effect. So that really started a really bad downward spiral. which took a year to not really get out of, but to find baseline again. When I expressed being suicidal, I was admitted to inpatient at Waukesha Memorial. They switched many medications around a lot, and I still don't know which meds I was all on while I was in there. They would switch it like every other day, still telling me that it took 6 to 8 weeks to feel the full effects. After 3 weeks of inpatient, I was transferred to their partial program, which is kind of like school. You go there in the morning and you go home at night. They continued to mess around with the medications, and I tried to glean any information I could from the groups, but I felt like I didn't belong there. I had no business being there because I felt I didn't have a reason to have depression or to be depressed, because the people who would talk in groups, I still remember some talked about they had a spouse that just died, or a girl had a miscarriage, or someone was going through a really bad breakup or a divorce, or someone just lost their job, and someone was going through a really bad custody battle. But I didn't have a reason like that. I just was depressed. So after 2 weeks of the partial program, insurance said you have to be done, but I still felt suicidal. And that was when I made my first attempt, even though I was pretty sure that it wouldn't work. So I was taken back to the inpatient unit for the weekend, and I had a case manager come from the partial program who said that she was going to work with me specifically to try to get to the bottom of everything and try to get me the help I really needed. But that Monday when I went back to the partial, the case manager wasn't there, and I didn't see her until the last day that I was in partial. And so it kind of took the whole summer being in that hospital, and I went back to school that fall in college. And it was really hard because there were days I couldn't go to class because I would have such bad anxiety attacks. I would spend a lot of nights just laying awake because the sleep medications kept me awake. And when they would switch me to a different med, they made me super groggy, where I'd have to take it at 6 p.m. and still be super tired by 9 a.m. In the first week of November, I really badly self-harmed. And that put me into the hospital, but I didn't want to go back to Waukesha, so I went to Aurora Psychiatric. I was there for a week, and the treatment there was really unpersonal. The psychiatrist there, it seemed like he really didn't care about his patients. So I didn't really receive the help that I needed. And from there, they told me to go to an inpatient or intensive outpatient therapy, which is kind of like taking a night class. You go for like 3 hours, 3 times a week at night. But I really didn't like the therapy there either. So all we would do was watch a video for an hour, work on a worksheet, and then talk a little bit. And the rest of school remained really difficult, but I did manage to finish that semester. And I took a winter term class, but being mostly alone on the campus then, the loneliness really got to me, and I continued to self-harm a lot. And that spring was no better, because I started to have physical health problems. March 28th of 2014, I woke up with sepsis, and I didn't go to the urgent care until that evening because my parents thought I was just going to sleep it off. So when I got to urgent care, they found my blood pressure to be 66/33, and my heart rate was over 170. So the nurse said I need to go to ER. I still remember my mom saying, well, should we get the car around? Should we drive her? And the nurse said, no, we already called the ambulance. When I was in the ER, they put a central line in my neck, and they had to take an x-ray to make sure they put it in the right spot. That's when they discovered that I had pneumonia, but I didn't really feel like I had pneumonia at the time. I was in the hospital for 10 days after that. A lot of the doctors did think that I was going to die, so they really don't know how I got through it. 4 days after I was discharged, I went to my primary care doctor for a follow-up, and they found out that I had mono. And that weekend, which happened to be Palm Sunday, I went to the ER, and they found out that my spleen was enlarged. And at that point, I had kind of had it. My physical health was gone, and my mental health and my emotional health were just absolutely horrible. And I still remember that I tried to make my spleen burst to try to end my life, which didn't work. So I kind of realized that the day before the sepsis had begun, I had been prescribed a new sleep medication. And I had taken one that night, and the bottle was still on my nightstand. It was the only thing that was available. All our hunting rifles were locked. Our knives were put away. My mom took away all the medications from the medicine cabinet, but she had forgotten this one. So April 28th, I took the remaining 59 pills that were in that bottle. And I woke up in the ICU 3 days later, and all the doctors thought that I was going to die. While I was in the hospital that time, they discovered that my thyroid count was off, and they diagnosed me with Hashimoto's thyroid disease. And that disease, I was told, can cause depression. And so I demanded to go off all of the medications I was on and only be on the thyroid med, just to figure out where my baseline was again. So they sent me back to Aurora to withdraw from the medications, and I was sent again to the IOP that was there that I still didn't like. I started to feel a little bit better, and that was 7 years ago. And from there, it became a slow downhill, followed by a steep slide. Off and on, I continued to hurt myself, and I struggled with horrible thoughts of dying, worthlessness, hopelessness, and helplessness. Finding the right therapist was really hard. One therapist told me she didn't know what more she could do for me or what more she could teach me, because all of the therapy I was doing, but nothing was really working. The end of 2015 and throughout 2016 was another really difficult year. I was diagnosed with another physical thing called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So that's when your autonomic nervous system of your brain, it doesn't function. So everything that's supposed to work automatically doesn't. So your heart rate, your blood pressure, body temperature, thought processes, those don't work well for me. That spring of 2016, I did manage to graduate college, despite the hospitalizations and problems. Throughout that whole year, my grandpa was diagnosed with cancer and underwent a lot of treatments and was hospitalized a lot. In June, my grandma's brother passed away. And in September, my great-grandma suffered a really bad stroke and was moved to hospice. And for a few days, she and my grandpa lived right next door to each other. And I'm sure if either of them had been awake at the time, they would have laughed about it. On September 16th, my great-grandma passed away. And 4 days later, my grandpa passed away. It's still really hard for me to think about. That January 2017, I went to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester for their program that helps with POTS. They discovered that my depression was really, really bad because they have this intake test that they do that measures a lot of things, but one of the things they measure is your depression. And on their scale, 20 was considered really, really high, and you should be getting help or seeking treatment. And mine was a 50. They tried to help me a little bit with the depression, but mostly with the POTS. And whatever help they tried to do with the depression was not helpful. Things remained halfway steady for a while after that, but they began to fall really badly downhill. The winter of 2018 was when I reached a breaking point. Beginning in late November and into December, I began to really hurt myself again and thought about dying a lot. In December, I started to make attempts again without telling anyone, and I didn't seek any medical treatment. And there came a point when I realized I couldn't be on medications without being suicidal, and now I couldn't even be off medications without being suicidal. So I just reached this point of complete emptiness and hopelessness. I remember crying in my work's bathroom for 10 minutes before I called my therapist. And she told me to go to an inpatient, just for my own safety. And I went back to Aurora, where they put me back on a medication that I had been on twice before, which didn't help, and this time was no different. After 2 weeks of being on that med, I had really bad side effects. And at that point, I was in their partial program, and the medications were changed. And I was in the partial program for 2 weeks also, before they told me to go to the IOP, but I wasn't ready. And I remember crying in front of the nurse that was handling my discharge papers. I was only in IOP for 2 days before they put me back into the partial program. And this time I had a therapist that should not be a therapist. She questioned why I had depression when I was able to be so functional. She basically told me that my depression can't be that bad if I'm able to hold a job, go to church, volunteer, and everything else I do in my life. And I was sitting there suicidal. After 2 weeks, I did not go to their IOP. I was sent home because the therapist told me there wasn't anything else she could teach me since I knew everything, and which isn't well, it's kind of true, but it's not. I can probably quote to you from the CBT and DBT handbooks, but it doesn't mean that they're always helpful. Within a week of being out, I was extremely suicidal again, and this time the therapist I had been seeing recommended I try Rogers in Oconomowoc. And I received real help there. I could just tell right away that the inpatient doctors, nurses, therapists, they cared and wanted everyone there to get better and get towards their recovery. The other thing that they did was they found a medication that really did start to help. And I was transferred from there to a residential program. So I was basically living there for 6 weeks. I was fully immersed in their treatment and skills and learning everything I could. And I really worked with their therapist, or case manager, I think he was, on really getting to the root of the things that I was struggling with. I was then transferred to their partial program, where it was still really, really helpful. And from there I went to their IOP. The med dosages were increased, and my treatment team thought that I would still be good for me to step down. And after that, I had to find my own therapist and psychiatrist. And I did find both, and I still am seeing both of them to today. The past year and a half then, I've still been learning, and my medications have still been being adjusted. The therapist and psychiatrist I'm seeing, they really, really care and want me to find stability, and they work really, really closely with me. And while this is just the last 8 years of my life, I know I'm going to be battling this for the rest of my life.
Did you notice how quiet it was in here? Yeah. What that tells me when it's so quiet is that we are really paying attention, and we are really with you as you were telling us about your life. It kind of reinforces, in my mind, the field of mental illness is so different from the medical field. So if you've got cancer or you've got some other medical problem, there is a kind of a very specific way that those things are addressed. And, and generally, you know, we can kind of take care of that. But the mental health field is a whole different animal, isn't it? And I think one of the things I was struck by is how long it took for you to find the people that really you felt were on your side, that understood you, and that were able to come up with things that were, more helpful than what other people had done. So I think sometimes we think, well, you know, you go to a psychiatrist, you get some pills, and then that's taken care of. And that whole thing, too, of getting those medications balanced, you know, and they keep saying, well, it takes weeks to figure out what dosage to use. So there are lots and lots of struggles in all of that, aren't there? And wow, you have struggled, and you're still here, and we're glad. Any other thoughts or questions that any of you have? Their mental illness, I think, is in every family. I have a sister who's bipolar, other people in my family that are dealing with mental health issues, so perhaps that's true in your family also. And I think back when I was growing up, the feeling was get over it. You know, we didn't like depression. We didn't like people who couldn't seem to get it together. And so we would scold them. And we would tell them it was all in their head. All kinds of things that we would do that were just not helpful at all. So I think we've come to a point now where we are more accepting of that this is a chemical imbalance in the brain, and so we are looking at that there are medications that can be helpful. But we still have a long way to go, don't we? There's still so much that can be done there. Any other thoughts or comments? Mary?
And we don't always know the people we're with who struggle. Rachel, I sat next to you in Bill Brown's choir.
Yeah,
She was always so interested in what I was doing.
yeah.
But we shared, she talked about her sister with the sheep herding.
Yeah.
I believe, Rachel, you did mention depression, but you didn't really make a big deal of it.
Yeah.
No idea how intense it was.
Yeah.
Rachel is such a wonderful person.
Yeah.
I loved sitting next to her. I
Yeah.
had no idea.
Yeah. We don't usually reveal all the things that we are thinking and that we are struggling with. I think all of us, to a certain extent, have a persona that we portray to those around us. So we don't usually, bring out all of those other things that are under the surface. So I just admire your courage in showing us more of yourself, because that is such a hard thing to do. And as Mary indicated, we don't love you less. We probably love you more because we know more about you. Any other thoughts that this brings up in your own families? Okay. I had one other thing that I wanted to share with you today also. And we were talking about grief, and again, getting back to when Ellen was talking about the loss of her son in a car accident, and then how she was dealing with the grief after that. I have a fellow chaplain at Fredert, Chris Prange is her name, and Chris, I think this was probably about 10 years ago, was at one of those rock climbing places. And you've seen those, they got a wall with those things that stick out and you can climb. And so she was doing that, and she fell, and she damaged her leg. And so they did all kinds of things to try to save the leg. But as time went on, it became clear to Chris that this leg was just not going to get better. And so she had it amputated below the knee. So since that time, Chris has been an amputee, and she has this prosthesis that she wears. And she's got a great sense of humor, so when she comes into the room and the patient notices that she's got the leg, she'll make some jokes about it, and she just has a wonderful way of coping with things. But she wrote this article recently, and it's called "Loss, Grief, and Other Things We Hate But Befall Us Anyway." And I just want to share that with you. Every year, autumn ushers in its gentle nudge toward accepting that the weather will be changing. Crisp, curly leaves will turn yellow, red, and orange as they begin to release their grasp and gently drift toward the ground, where they will rest in piles until covered by snow. We know it will get colder. Outdoor pursuits will become harder for a time. We begin to shift our attention to other things to soften the bitter onslaught of winter. I find myself looking at clothing advertisements on the internet. Warm patterned sweaters paired with the newest fashion bottoms and cute suede 1-inch heel fleece-lined boots. Like most women, I like fashion. Fashion is fun, and it's a great distractor as I ready myself for the dregs of another harsh Midwest winter. Suddenly it hits me. Dang, I can't wear any of those boots. I can't fit my prosthetic foot in them. And even if I could, the pitch of the heel would make walking hard to impossible. Sigh. Just forget it. I recall the many times when I've sat on the black padded bench in the aisle of the shoe store, covered in sweat, with metal shoehorn in hand, having my own personal pity party after yet another unsuccessful attempt at trying to jam my prosthetic foot into a boot I hoped would work. A deep sadness arises in the pit of my stomach as I realize the stylish vision I have of myself has been shot to dickens, all because of my complex grief relationship with footwear. So isn't it interesting how that gets her into the grief about the loss of her leg? I look around at the other ladies in the shoe department, contemplating their wide plethora of choices of style and heel height. I feel sad. I feel robbed. I choke back the tears attempting to well up behind my eyes as an odd ire arises, tinged with resentment. It's unfair. The dregs of winter are coming, and doggone it, I can't even get myself a cute pair of boots. I try to tell myself all sorts of things. It's only material stuff. Some people have it worse. You should feel lucky you're only a below-the-knee amputee. At least you have your knee. The inner dialogue is endless, but it never dissipates completely. That's the reality of grief. Sometimes it arises out of nowhere when you least expect it, like in the middle of the aisle at the shoe store. I begin to realize it's not just cute footwear I miss. I miss the ease of living I once had prior to the accident that led to my amputation. I miss being swift on my feet and carefree. I miss life without pain. I miss the old me, eternally fun, lighthearted, and blithe. Sitting on that shoe store bench, my strong desire to be strong or resilient didn't matter because my heart ached. I couldn't deny the tears percolating up in the corner of my eyes. The longing to pull myself up by my bootstraps only underscored the reality I wasn't even able to get my foot into the bootstraps. Never mind, into the boot, never mind the straps. I breathed. I told myself it was okay. I wasn't a wimp or a sissy just because I missed my 5 little piggies that had gone to the market in the sky. Somehow, in my pressure to prove my strength and resilience, I had forgotten that grief would continue to find its way into my world. Like a gust of wind, it would catch me off guard and knock me flat on my butt when I least expected it. It's tempting to guilt or shame ourselves when unshakable feelings of sadness and loss arise. As one mourning patient shared recently, I want to move on, but I can't. I feel hollow and stuck, and I hurt all over. Words like resilient and overcome and recover permeate so many healthcare narratives. And in the immediate years after my amputation, I absorbed their lure. But the mind and the heart and the body don't forget easily. In some ways, grief is like a marathon. requiring grit and fortitude to keep going with a keen awareness that turning back is not an option. But it's also like a dance, where we know we are wise to follow her lead, and grateful for a retrospective glance at the reluctant grace obtained through the experience. As I continue to listen to the stories of hospitalized patients in my role as a hospital chaplain, I'm saddled with the realization loss is never simple. We never get over it. Pain and loss change us, not necessarily for the worse, but for the deeper and the wiser. As Candace Osifort Russell shares, to try to bounce back to our old ways of being is to refuse to accept there is no going back as much as we would like to, and to turn away from the pain that comes from radical growth that's being forced on us, whether we want to face it or not. There's an integrity that can be found in owning one's grief, in claiming it as a vehicle for connecting with others on a deeper, richer, more vulnerable level. To wish it away is to do ourselves and others a disservice. Having a literal 1 foot in the grave has caused me to slow down and appreciate life more, to acknowledge life's tenderness and fleetingness, to accept the gift that time allows in her endowment to me, to whittle away within my creative endeavors and to listen. The heart of the beating world longs for tears to fertilize her soil, for tender hands to churn and overturn the crusty hardness that life imparts. Time truly is a gift, and so is our fragile, vulnerable, beautiful humanity. I just thought that was a really good article. And I think what struck me again is that our desire is to put grief away. We want to get over it. We want to get past it. And I think, her insight is that we have to learn to live with it. And we have to not be surprised when it keeps on resurrecting itself. So you might be buying a pair of shoes, and your grief comes and reminds you, you're not done with that yet. There's still more to be experienced there. So I thought her comment of how it has made her deeper and wiser was really a very important truth for us to look at. So we're all dealing with grief, aren't we? As we think of the losses that we've had in our lifetimes and our parents. My recent grief is the loss of my brother. So we all have those griefs that we are carrying. And to continue to experience that, to feel it, to look at it, to see what it is trying to bring to our awareness, that's an ongoing thing. Have you ever been with people who get in touch with their grief and they start to cry and they hate it and they apologize? And they say, I didn't want to, I don't know where that came from. And they want to move away. I know that's what happens to me. So, when that happens, enter in there and take that person's hand and say, no, don't move away. Let's go there. Let's talk some more about that. That can be very, very healing for that person. Anything else that kind of has perked up for you as we've talked about some of these things today?
when I was about 5, my father and my sister were killed.
Mm.
And there was a terrible war in our country. And people killed each other. But once this war was over, the army that took over the country afterwards, they also moved from places to places, killing people. But they don't want this to be reported. So my father and my sisters were few of many people who were killed by the army, who ended up taking the power and are now still leading our country. And the official narrative that they wanted to push out is that they did not kill anybody. So if I went public in my country and talked to people, then that they killed my father, I'll be put in jail
Mm-hmm.
and probably forgiven. So that's one way that you can even talk about it. It happened. You just have to sink in it and you can even talk about it. So there are some stories that are a bit hard when something happens and you can't even talk about it. And I use Facebook. So something that I don't know posted on Facebook about her uncle who died just the way my father died, in the same story, and he was kind of grieving like somebody should be responsible. Somebody commented on this Facebook page and said, your father died of cholera in Congo because he had killed people. So instead of grieving with the person, they just went after him in a really bad way. I was like, I think the only way to survive is to just be quiet. Don't talk about it. Hopefully someday they will be checked. People will talk about them and people will be allowed.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I feel that these conversations, this is 27 years ago. So my mother was very young. She was still alive. So that was she was her husband. And she came in grief about him. There's a lot of simple matters. Who are just like, oh. I don't know how this fits into what we talk about, but it's something that I care about. That's right.
Well, it fits. Yeah, it does fit. And I'm just going to try to summarize here because I don't know if everybody was able to hear. But what he was speaking about is in his country. What country was it?
This is Rwanda.
Rwanda. So in Africa. And some of you may remember that there was that there were two tribes that were attacking each other. And so again, there was a great loss of life there. And he has experienced that personally. His father and his sister, I think you said, were murdered in that, that struggle that was going on in Rwanda. And the most difficult thing for him in his grief is that he hasn't been able to talk about it. Because again, the army that is in power now, if he would speak about what was done to his family, then he would be arrested and he would be imprisoned. So he's not able to talk about this terrible loss and grief that he has had in his life. And then he also posted on Facebook and he got, again, comments that were not helpful. And so that, again, is a tremendously important issue of where do we go when we've got grief and we can't find anyone who will hear it and anyone who will give us compassion as we speak about the awful, terrible things that we have had to go through. So that, I really thank you for sharing that, because that's, your heart has really been through some tremendous trauma there. And again, I thank you for sharing that with us today, because here you know that there are people that love you, and we can't take it away, but we can stand with you, and we can support you. And what a challenge for you to try to go on with your life and to come to a new country and try to rebuild. That is a tremendously difficult thing. So thank you for sharing that with us. Again, what that tells me is we don't know. As Mary said, she's next to Rachel and Choir, and we didn't know all of the things that were there. So don't you think that that's true, again, for all of us? One of the things I'm most grateful for in this class is that we've begun to open up to each other. And I just think that is that's an incredible thing. That's a wonderful thing. Because again, in normal everyday life, we just go about our business. But at some point in time, we got to be there for each other. And how is that going to happen unless we have some trust that we can tell each other things? Any other thoughts about today? So again, thank you so much. Thank you, Rachel. And I'll see you next week, and we will finish up our 6-week session.